Self-defense. What's the most effective way to teach it? Well, safely and correctly, I would assume. In this video, I kind of wanted to talk to those that are teaching martial arts or aspiring to teach martial arts. Maybe you have some experience and you have an opportunity to teach at the school you attend, or maybe you've been teaching for a while and you're just looking for someone else's perspective. I just wanted to give my thoughts a little bit in this video. I'm not going to talk about details of techniques or any one art specifically. I kind of want to keep this general and just talk about concepts, but my self-defense background is mainly in Hapkido, so my perspective and my opinions are going to be based off of that. Regardless, I think that these tips can be helpful. It's nothing groundbreaking, but sometimes it's nice to hear from someone else and just share our thoughts. So that's what I kind of wanted to do with this. So first of all, teaching and learning are 100% based on the teacher and the learner, or the student. So what that means is there's no one single answer to the best way or the best method to teach anything, not just self-defense. So that's the most important thing. You have to find in yourself as a teacher what your best way to convey information is to students. And then as you get experienced with more and more different types of people as your students, you can kind of cater to different personality types, and you kind of understand how to work with each person as an individual. So obviously experience is the number one factor when it comes to teaching something and getting better at sharing information with a student and having them retain it. So I'm going to try to keep things as general as possible because I don't know you personally and I don't know your students, so I don't understand your relationship and the things that you've already figured out. But I do think what I'm about to talk about is a pretty surefire way to build a foundation and kind of have a flow chart of how you convey information. Throughout our lives, we hear and learn that starting with the basics is the way to go, and picking up a skill or learning anything, whether it be with education or with physical training, whatever it may be, you have to start out with the very smallest of information before you can build up and work your way up to the more advanced or more complex aspects of what you're learning or training or getting better at. You have to feed a baby milk before you can give it solid food, and it takes time to develop that ability. So it goes without saying that your curriculum with self-defense is going to start with the basics, and I think anywhere you go that's going to be the case. You're going to start with simple movements, and you're going to start with simple concepts before you can work your way up to more advanced techniques. But I'm going to go a step further and say that when you start with any technique, that all variables need to be removed and the situation needs to be ideal. A lot of martial arts get a bad rap for practicing self-defense with compliant partners. And while that is a problem, if it's all the time, it's very necessary to start with a compliant partner so that you can understand what you're doing before there's resistance introduced. So I'll take, for instance, the Hapkido armbar, one of the basic techniques in Hapkido, one of my favorite things to teach to new students. We usually start this technique from a basic wrist grab, and that kind of puts you in the position to work your way into the technique, and it kind of gives you a head start. And yes, we do start with a compliant partner where they're not doing anything but standing there and letting the technique be applied to them. But don't go just yet, because I'm getting somewhere. This is what we call ideal conditions, and this brings me back to my physics class that I took freshman year of college, where we learned about motion and velocity, and we applied equations based off of ideal conditions, meaning there was no extra force from air resistance or no other forces around acting on the object. And I always thought to myself, what's the point of this? This is not how the real world works. Nothing is ever ideal. There's always going to be extra forces, so why are we learning equations of something that's never going to happen? And as you grow older and wiser and you learn more, you understand that you have to start with these basic equations before you add in all these other factors. Because if you started with the equation with everything in it, you wouldn't be able to see what the root is and what is actually causing everything to happen the way it does. So bringing that back around to our Hapkido self-defense, we start in these ideal conditions so that the only thing that matters is performing the technique properly. Then once a general understanding is reached by the student, which usually doesn't take long for these basic techniques, then we can start adding in these other factors, whether it be using the other arm or going from a different attack, from a punch, from a body grab, whatever it may be. We keep the root technique the same, we're just adding different angles to it, and this is going to help the student sculpt a complete picture of what they're actually doing, but they have this base knowledge that they're going to be able to apply wherever they put it. And once they're comfortable performing the technique on either side from different attacks, obviously you're not going to tell them what side you're going to attack. You're not going to tell them what type of attack you're going to do once they're comfortable. Then we can introduce resistance to the equation. All this time before, the attacker was just performing their singular attack or grab or whatever, and then being compliant for the rest of the technique, allowing the student, the defender, to perform their technique, again, without resistance, until they've developed that confidence, which is a very important step in the process. But then you can inch your way closer and closer to these real life situations where you can never predict what's going to happen. But that's where sparring and pressure testing comes into play, and this is where resistance gets involved. Now, you as a school owner or an instructor of a class get to decide how much you want to mix in everything. But I'm personally someone that likes to err on the side of caution, so I don't have all of our techniques and drills in class always going 100% all the time, because that's going to ramp up injuries. I take pride in the fact that at our school we rarely have any major injuries. They are a part of any contact sport, but we have to use our common sense as well. But the reason I'm talking about this is I have been to schools in the past where they kind of have the instructor in the middle demonstrate a technique, and then everybody pairs off to practice the technique, but they go right into resistance. And if it's something that the students never learned before, then they don't really understand what they're doing. If all the other person's doing is trying to resist and try to get out of the technique, then sure, that is more like real life. But we need to take those steps. That's the point of having an organized class, is to start with nothing so that the student understands what's correct, and then they can build from that. And then when you introduce resistance, then you can see the counters to the other person's counters, and then you can start building off of that. But I believe this step in the process is often overlooked for the sake of time. You might practice the technique one time with nothing, and then you kind of get pushed into doing it with full resistance 100% in sparring. And again, you will learn your way around the technique eventually, but removing that elementary step is detrimental to a student, especially one that's a beginner and they're not very experienced with anything. Now, I will agree that balance is extremely important, and there are many schools that will err too much on the side of caution, and they might never pressure test, and they might never practice something with full resistance. And that's just as much of a problem, because if that person has mastered the technique but only with compliant partners, then they really don't know the technique. And it gets dangerous when somebody has the confidence that they know how to defend themselves, but they've never been in any type of high intensity situation. And even if you have years of experience, if it's not the right type of experience, then it doesn't just click for you in a real life situation. I can't speak from personal experience, because thankfully I've never been in an actual situation where lives are actually in danger or anything like that. But I have spoken to people who have been in those situations, and I've done research and I've read about it. You have to have real trial runs under your belt if you want those years of training to kick in. I know I rambled quite a bit, and this video is probably longer than it needed to be, but the moral here is balance. If you decide to be super cautious, then you need to be straightforward and honest with your students, and don't let overconfidence be a problem with them, and don't be one of those instructors that, demonstrates a technique on somebody and tells them that they need to be hurting when you do this, and kind of mind control them to go down because you're the instructor and they have to comply with you. Telling somebody something is going to work 100% when in fact it's not, is only going to potentially damage them in the future. Now, that said, if you're on the other end of the spectrum, then you need to be wary of recklessness, and you need to be able to keep things from going out of hand in a classroom environment. Sending people home from class with real injuries every night is not necessarily an indicator that your style of teaching and your art are just so intense and so hardcore that they're unbeatable. It could just mean that you're not teaching properly and you don't have good control over your class. And I know it's typical of me to talk about the absolutes and the extremes on each side of the spectrum, but I do that to point out the negativities on either side and kind of bring those to light. I don't know more than you, and I'm not better than you at anything, so this is not about me lecturing you. I just think communication is important, and starting conversations like this is great. So I'm interested in discussing these kinds of things. If you have any thoughts, I would definitely like to hear them in the comments. We all have our own perspectives, and it's important that we share them because they can only make us better. Thanks for watching, and keep training.